It began like any other morning, the kind that didn't stand out in memory until it became unforgettable. The grandfather, a man in his late 60s, had always been an early riser. Fishing wasn't just a pastime for him, it was ritual, a steady rhythm in a life otherwise marked by routine and family commitments. He was a figure of quiet reliability, the kind of person you could set your clock to. On that morning, just as he had done countless times before, he gathered his gear before dawn, slipped into his weathered jacket, and left the house without fanfare. His wife remembered hearing the creak of the screen door and the muted shuffle of boots across the porch. That was the last sound of him she would ever hear. The lake sat only a few miles from their home, a place he had fished since boyhood. Its waters were calm in the early hours, still holding the mist of night before the sun burned through. Locals often described it as a living presence, deep, cold, and unpredictable, with sudden shifts in current that defied its glassy surface. To the grandfather, though, it was familiar, comforting even. He knew the hidden coves and the shelves where bass collected, the seasonal shifts in water level, the way weather shaped the bite. It was, in his mind, a place of peace. That morning was no exception. A clear sky, no heavy winds, nothing unusual. He carried with him the same small wooden tackle box that had seen decades of use, and a simple aluminum boat he'd maintained himself. He wasn't a man of extravagance, never interested in expensive equipment or trophies. Fishing for him was solitude, a chance to escape noise and return home with quiet pride and sometimes a story. To his grandchildren, he was almost mythic, the grandfather who could turn any still water into a tale of the one that got away. By late morning, his wife expected him back, or at least a phone call letting her know he was still out on the water. He wasn't the type to lose track of time. Family lunches mattered to him. But as noon passed, and then 2 o'clock, the unease began to creep in. At first, it was a simple thought, traffic, or maybe he'd decided to try one more cove. Then came the longer silence, the unanswered call to his cell phone, the sound of voicemail playing his voice when she dialed again. That was when her worry shifted from mild impatience to genuine fear. By the time the sun started to dip lower, family members had gathered. One son drove toward the lake, certain he would find him packing up, sheepish about losing track of the hours. But when he arrived at the familiar access point, something felt wrong immediately. The small parking area held his truck, parked just as it always was. Inside, the coffee thermos still sat in the cup holder, half empty, and his jacket hung on the passenger seat. The boat trailer was gone, meaning he was out on the water. That discovery brought temporary relief until the sun walked to the shoreline. Floating in the reeds only 100 yards offshore was the boat. It drifted aimlessly, bow tilted as though nudged by the breeze. From a distance, it seemed like any small vessel untied and forgotten. But as he got closer, dread set in. There was no figure sitting inside, no movement of a fishing rod, no familiar silhouette of his father. The boat was empty. The tackle box was there, open, as if he had been mid-cast. A rod lay across the bench seat. There were no signs of struggle, no spilled gear, no overturned bucket, just the stillness of a boat without its fisherman. Authorities were called immediately. Deputies arrived as the last light fell across the water, their spotlights sweeping across the surface. They secured the boat, confirming what the family already knew. There was no trace of him, no life jacket floating nearby, no hat, no footprints along the muddy shore. It was as though he had stepped into thin air. His phone was found, tucked neatly inside the tackle box, dry, switched off. That detail unsettled investigators. Why would an experienced outdoorsman leave his phone behind when he always carried it in a pocket? The family stood together on the shore that night, watching officers drag the boat back to land, their minds trying to make sense of the impossible. He was not a reckless man. He wasn't careless with safety. He never drank while fishing, never strayed far without telling someone. His entire life had been defined by reliability, yet here was his boat, untethered without him. The scene didn't suggest panic or accident or even preparation. It suggested sudden absence, like a moment simply erased. By midnight, the lake had transformed from peaceful retreat to suspected crime scene. Flashing lights reflected on its surface as search and rescue teams assembled. Divers prepared to descend in the darkness, knowing that every hour without answers made recovery less likely. Family members clung to one another, some insisting he must have had a health episode, others fearing something far worse. For them, that night was the start of a story that would stretch across years, but in that first moment, all they could feel was the crushing realization that he was gone, and no one knew why. It was the kind of disappearance that leaves more silence than evidence. A quiet morning turned into a mystery that would haunt them all. And as the boat sat on the trailer once again, pulled from the water without the man who had set it afloat, one question settled like a shadow over the family. Where did he go? The hours after the empty boat was found quickly escalated from anxious waiting to full-scale emergency. Once deputies confirmed he was not on the shoreline and nowhere in sight, the search was officially declared. That night, spotlights danced across the dark surface of the lake, the beams sweeping over waves that gave back nothing. Divers were summoned from the nearest county, men and women who knew the risks of working in water so deep and unpredictable. As they pulled on heavy suits, the family clung to hope that maybe he had simply drifted, maybe he had managed to reach another shore. But with every passing minute, that hope shrank. By morning, the search grew into a coordinated operation. Sheriff's deputies, state patrol, and game wardens lined the banks. The air buzzed with the sound of a helicopter circling overhead, scanning for any sign of movement, a hand breaking the surface, a jacket caught on driftwood, any disturbance that might suggest where he had gone. The water below was marked with fluorescent buoys, each one a point divers would descend to methodically. On the shore, volunteers began arriving, locals who knew the family, people who had grown up fishing beside the missing man, all determined to help. They carried binoculars, search dogs, and in some cases nothing more than their willingness to walk the perimeter mile after mile. The lake became a hive of activity, but it felt unnervingly quiet all the same. The only sounds were the whir of the helicopter blades, the slosh of water as divers disappeared beneath, and the subdued murmur of officers coordinating radio calls. Each time a diver resurfaced, faces turned in anticipation, but they shook their heads. The silt at the bottom was thick, visibility less than a foot in front of them. The lake was like a vault, swallowing anything that entered. The family was escorted to a nearby ranger station, but they refused to stay indoors. They lingered at the edge of the water, watching the operation unfold, desperate for news. His wife kept her eyes fixed on the surface, convinced she would see him rise, drenched but alive, waving for help. She whispered prayers under her breath, her voice cracking as she tried to believe he was still out there. His sons paced, torn between wanting to join the search themselves and being told by deputies to stay back, to let professionals handle it. His grandchildren stood together in stunned silence, too young to fully understand but old enough to feel the crushing weight of something terribly wrong. Throughout the day, the search extended beyond the lake itself. Teams fanned out into the surrounding woods, combing trails, ravines, and access points. Could he have made it to shore and collapsed from exhaustion or injury? Deputies scoured mudflats for tracks, but found only animal prints and the faint indentations of boat trailers. No human footprints, no drag marks, nothing to suggest a man had walked out of the water. It was as if the boat had carried him to the center and then returned without him. As night fell again, the search entered its second day. The operation expanded, with sonar equipment brought in to sweep the depths. Screens flickered in the command post, showing ghostly outlines of submerged logs and debris, but nothing resembling a body. Investigators marked potential anomalies and sent divers back down, but the results were the same. Emptiness. The absence of evidence became its own chilling presence. By the third day, exhaustion showed on everyone's faces. The sheriff gave briefings to local press gathered near the docks, carefully worded statements about continuing efforts, and no signs of foul play at this time. But behind the calm tone was an unspoken reality. The longer a body remained unfound, the less likely it would be recovered intact. Families of drowning victims sometimes waited weeks, even months, for remains to surface. In other cases, they never did. That was the possibility no one wanted to say aloud. Still, the community rallied. Churches organized meal trains for the family. Neighbors took turns keeping vigil at the lake. Strangers arrived to walk the shoreline shoulder to shoulder, scanning every patch of reeds, every piece of driftwood, convinced that persistence might succeed where sonar had not. Search dogs were brought in, sniffing along the banks, sometimes alerting in places that raised hopes, but each dig, each probe came up empty. By the end of the first week, the sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Hundreds of volunteer hours logged, multiple agencies involved, thousands of dollars in resources deployed. Yet not one solid lead emerged. The boat had been found. His phone was accounted for. His truck remained untouched. Beyond that, there was nothing. No articles of clothing washed ashore, no fishing rod snagged in weeds, no signs of struggle. For the family, the lack of answers was worse than bad news. An accident, even a tragedy, at least had closure. But this was a void. His wife replayed every detail of that morning in her mind, wondering if she had missed something in his voice, some hint he had been unwell, something that explained why he might have fallen in. His sons questioned whether they had overlooked a health problem, a dizzy spell, a heart attack. Investigators listened, nodded, and filed each thought, but none of it drew them closer to finding him. On the 10th day, officials scaled back the active search, shifting to what they called monitoring. Helicopters stopped flying, divers packed up their gear, and volunteers were thanked and dismissed. The shoreline returned to quiet, stripped of the urgency that had filled it only days before. The lake returned to stillness, as if nothing had happened. For the family, though, life had tilted permanently. They drove away from the water's edge without him, carrying nothing but questions. The search had ended, but the mystery had only deepened, and with no answers, theories began to take root. When the official search was scaled back, what remained was speculation. Without a body, without evidence, the human mind filled the silence with theories. Investigators approached it as they always did, with the most plausible explanations first. A drowning was the simplest answer. Despite his reputation as a capable outdoorsman, even strong swimmers could be pulled under by cold water shock or sudden muscle cramps. Officers explained that in lakes with shifting thermoclines, a person could be incapacitated within seconds. It was possible he had fallen from the boat, inhaled water, and sunk before he had a chance to call for help. But his family resisted this idea. He was cautious, always wearing a flotation vest, always aware of where his balance was in the boat. They pointed to the empty life jacket stored neatly under the seat, suggesting he hadn't planned to go in the water at all. The second theory leaned toward medical emergency. At his age, the chance of sudden cardiac arrest, stroke, or seizure could not be ignored. Perhaps he had clutched his chest, toppled into the lake, and drowned before he could fight back. Deputies reviewed his medical history and found nothing alarming. No diagnosed heart condition, no medication that suggested imminent risk. His family emphasized how active he was, still chopping firewood, still carrying groceries for his wife, still climbing in and out of boats with ease. To them, the idea of his body giving out in such a sudden, catastrophic way did not fit. The third possibility was more unsettling: intentional disappearance. Investigators were trained to consider every angle, even the ones that seemed unlikely. Could he have staged the empty boat, left his phone behind, and walked away from his life? The family rejected it outright. He had no financial troubles, no secret debts, no strained relationships. He adored his grandchildren, doted on his wife, and had future plans already in place. In fact, a vacation had been booked for later that summer, a fishing trip with his eldest son to a river they had both wanted to see for years. Nothing suggested a man preparing to vanish voluntarily. Still, rumors began to circulate. Locals who gathered at the small-town diner or bait shop whispered in low voices. Some said he had grown weary of life and chosen the lake as his final resting place. Others claimed darker possibilities, that he had been taken, perhaps lured from his boat by someone he knew. But the most persistent whispers were about the lake itself. Fishermen spoke of places where the bottom dropped without warning, pits so deep sonar had never charted them fully. They described sudden currents, whirlpools that formed when winds shifted, sucking objects downward and never releasing them. Stories surfaced about old drownings, teenagers lost in the 70s, a hunter in the 90s, bodies never recovered, presumed trapped in submerged caves or tangled timber. For those who believed in the lake's dark reputation, his disappearance was no mystery at all. He had become part of a pattern, another name added to the quiet list of people who went out onto that water and never came back. His wife listened to these stories with quiet anger. To her, they were excuses, myths to cover a failure of answers. She knew her husband. He wasn't careless, he wasn't reckless, and he would have fought to the last breath to return home. The idea that he had simply slipped beneath the surface and joined some unsolved history of tragedies felt too dismissive. The family clung to what they knew. He had no reason to disappear, no weakness that would explain sudden collapse, no foolish habit that would make him fall victim to the lake's dangers. What haunted them most was the boat itself, adrift but orderly, nothing tipped, nothing missing. It didn't look like the aftermath of panic. It looked like interruption. Investigators couldn't ignore that detail either. Boats abandoned at scenes of drowning often carried signs of struggle. Gear scattered, rods broken, tackle spilled. His looked as though he had set it down mid-task and stepped away. That eerie order only fueled the uncertainty. In the absence of definitive answers, the case lingered in limbo. Police reports listed drowning as the most likely cause, but words like undetermined and unresolved appeared again and again. The family lived with those phrases hanging over them, a bureaucratic attempt to explain the unexplainable. Each theory carried its own weight, but none fit perfectly. And in the small town nearby, the whispers about the lake grew louder, as though the water itself had swallowed not only the man but the truth. The first days of searching had been frantic, fueled by adrenaline and the belief that recovery was only hours away. But as the weeks stretched on, urgency gave way to routine, and routine eventually slipped into exhaustion. Investigators continued to pursue every lead, but each one dissolved into nothing. Detectives checked pawn shops and trading posts across the county, hoping his fishing gear might surface. If he had been robbed, if someone had boarded his boat, perhaps the stolen items would turn up for quick cash. Yet not a single lure, rod, or piece of equipment matching his belongings was ever logged. The tackle box, the rods, even his favorite knife were gone with him, as though the water had consumed them all. Attention then shifted to his personal life. Financial records were reviewed for unusual withdrawals, sudden transfers, or hidden debts. Investigators pored over bank statements, retirement accounts, and even insurance policies, searching for motive. But every page painted the same picture: stability. He had savings untouched, bills paid on time, and no hidden assets. His life was transparent, the quiet profile of a man who had never sought more than his home, his family, and his time on the water. Nothing hinted at a staged disappearance. Detectives interviewed friends and extended relatives, circling back to the family again and again, asking the same questions in slightly different ways. Was there conflict at home? Any sign of depression? Had he ever spoken about leaving, even in passing? Each time, the answers were the same. No. His wife sat across from investigators with folded hands, her voice steady but laced with quiet anger. She insisted they were wasting time chasing shadows when the truth had to be somewhere in the lake. His children echoed the same frustration. They knew their father as a man of consistency, not someone prone to secrets. Yet the lack of evidence left investigators circling without progress. As months passed, the tone of the case changed. What had started as an active search transformed into a file marked open but stagnant. Deputies still checked tips when they came in: an unverified sighting in another town, a story about a stranger camping near the lake. But each one crumbled under scrutiny. The family waded through each false lead, their hope raised and crushed in the same breath. Even the media, which had once covered the disappearance with intensity, began to move on. Headlines shifted, and his name appeared less frequently, replaced by newer tragedies. The lake itself became the focal point of the town's imagination. It was no longer just a place to fish or swim. It became a name spoken with caution, almost superstition. Locals began to call it cursed. Stories resurfaced about past drownings, some verified, others distorted over time. An old-timer claimed he remembered 2 boys lost in the 70s, their bodies never recovered. Another swore a hunter had vanished along the northern shore in the 90s, his boat found eerily similar to the grandfather's. Whether fact or folklore, each tale added to the lake's growing reputation. Parents warned children not to go near the water. Teenagers dared each other to swim at night. The lake was no longer neutral. It carried a darkness tied to his disappearance. For the family, that shift in perception was agonizing. The place he had loved, where he had spent countless mornings in peace, was now marked by whispers of bad luck and death. His grandchildren, once eager to fish with him, began to avoid the shoreline altogether. His wife could no longer bear to look at the water without feeling sick. What had been a place of comfort became a wound. The investigation files thickened with paperwork, but not with answers. Every effort, financial audits, background checks, gear tracing, ended in the same blank space. No evidence of crime, no proof of accident, no sign of voluntary disappearance. He was simply gone. Detectives admitted quietly, off record, that some cases never yielded conclusions. Some waters didn't give back what they took. The family heard these words like a final blow, as if the system itself had surrendered. The weeks turned into months, and life moved forward in ways that felt unnatural. Birthdays passed, holidays arrived, but his absence was always at the center. His chair at the table remained empty, his truck sat in the driveway, the coffee thermos stayed in its place. Every ordinary object became a reminder of the extraordinary mystery. The unanswered questions multiplied until they became heavier than any single explanation. And as the second year approached, the silence around the case grew louder than the search itself. He had vanished without trace, and now even the investigation seemed to dissolve into memory. All that remained was the lake, carrying with it both the family's grief and the town's unease, a body of water that now held not only their grandfather, but also the story of a place people began to believe would never let go of its secrets. In the absence of answers, the family created their own rituals, ways to keep him present when everything else conspired to erase him. Each year on the anniversary of his disappearance, they gathered at the edge of the lake, standing on the same shoreline where his boat had drifted back without him. Some brought flowers, others candles, sometimes even personal items that reminded them of him. His wife always came with lilies, the flowers he had once planted in their yard because she loved them. She set them gently in the water, watching them float aimlessly before sinking, as if the lake itself was swallowing her offering. The gatherings began small, his wife, his sons, a few neighbors who wanted to show support. But over the years they grew, drawing in extended family, grandchildren, even strangers who had heard the story and felt compelled to stand with them. Some prayed aloud, others stood in silence, each carrying their own private memory. These vigils were not meant to be ceremonies of closure, because closure never came. Instead, they were acknowledgments of absence, markers of time passing without resolution. For the grandchildren, the lake vigils became formative memories. At first, they didn't understand why they stood by the water each year, why the adults cried quietly or held hands in silence. But as they grew older, the weight of what was missing became clearer. They learned to associate their grandfather not with the man who had taught them to bait hooks and tell stories, but with the void he left behind. His disappearance became part of their identity, shaping the way they thought about safety, trust, and the fragility of life. One granddaughter later admitted she could never sit in a boat without feeling panic rise in her chest. Another grandson, once eager to fish, abandoned the hobby altogether, convinced the water would take him too. Even in adulthood, the grandchildren carried the wound, an absence that did not fade with time but sharpened, becoming something inherited. The question of what happened that morning followed them into every stage of their lives, unanswered and heavy. For his wife, the vigils were both a comfort and a torment. She believed in honoring him, in refusing to let his memory fade into silence, but each year she also confronted the reality that no answers had surfaced. The act of placing flowers on the water was both love and grief entwined. She would watch the lilies drift and think about his boat, how it too had floated without purpose that day, carrying no explanation, just absence. Sometimes she spoke to the water as if he could hear, asking him to give her a sign, to come back in some small way. But the lake remained still, its only reply the sound of wind across the surface. The community around the lake came to know these vigils as well. Locals respected the family's presence, often giving them space, but some also saw it as a reminder of the lake's dark reputation. Each year, the sight of flowers drifting across the surface reinforced the idea that the waters carried more than fish and silt, that they carried secrets, lives swallowed without reason. The gatherings became almost folklore, the kind of story retold in hushed voices to visitors passing through. Inside the family, the absence reshaped daily life in ways that were subtle but constant. Holidays never felt whole. His empty chair remained at Thanksgiving, though eventually it was moved to a corner because the sight was too painful. Photographs of him stayed on the walls, but they seemed to look back with a kind of accusation, as if asking why no one had found him. The grandchildren, now adults, sometimes avoided family dinners, because they could not bear the way every conversation inevitably circled back to him, to the mystery that had never been solved. The pain was not dramatic, but steady, eroding them over years. His wife never remarried, holding on to the idea that as long as she remained loyal, he was not entirely gone. She lived in the same house, kept his belongings in place, never discarding the little things he had left behind. His sons carried the burden differently. One grew obsessed, keeping files of articles, notes, and lake maps, determined to solve the mystery himself. Another avoided the topic altogether, shutting down whenever the subject arose. Their grief diverged, but both paths led back to the same place, the water and the lack of answers it had left them with. The vigils were meant to provide unity, but they also underscored division. Each family member carried their grief differently, and the silence between them grew heavy. Yet they returned year after year, as if compelled by something larger than choice. The flowers touched the water, the candles flickered in the wind, and the lake remained indifferent, swallowing each gesture as it had swallowed him. By the 10th anniversary, the family's vigil had become almost ritualized, expected even by the town. Reporters no longer came, police no longer gave statements, but the family still stood by the shoreline, holding on to what little they could. The absence had become a presence of its own, shaping their lives in ways they never could have imagined. And though they had learned to live around it, the wound never healed. The lake still held their grandfather, and with him, the truth of what had happened that morning. Nearly 10 years had passed since the morning he vanished, and though the case had grown cold in the official sense, his family had never stopped carrying it. Life had reshaped itself around the absence, days and years accumulating with no answers. Then, when most had resigned themselves to never knowing more, nature intervened. Late one summer, a violent storm descended on the region, one of the worst in decades. Sheets of rain hammered the countryside, roads disappeared beneath rushing water, and entire trees were ripped from the earth and carried away like sticks. Power went out across multiple towns, and the lake, swollen with runoff, transformed into something unrecognizable. The usually placid surface became violent, waves colliding against the shore, debris thrashing in currents no one had ever seen there before. For hours, the storm held the region hostage. Families huddled inside, listening to the groan of wind and the roar of water against their homes. When it finally passed, the aftermath looked almost unearthly. Fallen trees sprawled across fields, bridges sagged under collapsed beams, and the lake itself bore the deepest scars. Shorelines that had been familiar for generations were altered beyond recognition. Entire docks had been ripped loose and thrown onto land, splintered into pieces. Coves had widened, marshy areas drowned under layers of new silt. It was as though the lake had been drained of its secrets, pulled apart and rearranged in plain view. The following day, locals began to survey the damage. Some came to mourn broken property, others simply to gawk at the sheer power of nature. Along the edges of the lake, people found twisted branches lodged into fences, pieces of overturned boats, and even items that looked as if they had been hidden beneath the water for decades. One man swore he had seen a rusted wagon wheel half buried in the mud. Another claimed a wooden beam from an old pier had washed up, its bolts still clinging to rotted planks. The storm had dredged the lake's depths, scattering its history across the banks. But it wasn't just relics of the past that appeared. Among the piles of wreckage and natural debris, something else surfaced, something far more personal. Near the southern shoreline, a group of teenagers came across a battered box wedged between reeds and mud. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a rusted toolbox, its hinges corroded, its shape warped. But when they pried it open, the contents told a different story. Inside were the remains of fishing equipment, spools of line, hooks fused together by rust, the faint outlines of lures that had once been bright and metallic. And among those ruined items were objects that bore unmistakable marks of identity. A pocket knife, its handle engraved with initials, a lighter, tarnished but still carrying the family name etched into its side, even a water-worn photograph, barely visible beneath stains, but clear enough for one of the teenagers to recognize the smiling figure. Word spread quickly. By evening, deputies were back at the lake, securing the box and photographing the scene. Family members were contacted, and when they arrived, emotions erupted. His wife collapsed at the sight of the pocket knife, the very one he had carried for decades. His sons stood in silence, staring at the lighter they knew as well as their own belongings. It was undeniable. These were his things, pulled from the water after nearly 10 years. The lake had finally given something back. For investigators, the discovery reignited the case. The items were carefully cataloged, transported to the state lab, and tested for any trace evidence. But the years underwater had left their mark, metal corroded, paper ruined, fibers nearly dissolved. Still, the symbolic weight was staggering. After a decade of emptiness, here was proof that he had not walked away, had not vanished into some new life. His belongings had been down there, trapped, waiting for the storm to tear them loose. For the family, the discovery brought both relief and renewed torment. Relief that they finally had a tangible link to him again, that the lake had not erased him completely. But also torment in the way it reopened the wound, forcing them to confront the mystery all over again. If his belongings had been preserved all this time, where was he? Why did the lake return these pieces but not the man himself? His wife held the knife in her hand, her fingers trembling, and whispered that he must still be out there, somewhere in the depths that continued to guard their secrets. The community, too, reacted with unease. The storm's destruction had been fierce, but this revelation shifted the focus. Conversations at the diner turned back to the disappearance, old theories resurfacing with new life. Some insisted the storm had loosened debris that had hidden him for years and that more would surface soon. Others whispered that perhaps someone had hidden the tackle box intentionally, and the storm had simply revealed what human hands had once concealed. That week, the lake transformed once again from ordinary landscape to the center of mystery. Deputies combed the newly reshaped shoreline, probing mudflats and scanning for additional evidence. Locals gathered at the southern edge, standing in silence as if waiting for the water to confess more. The box and its contents had reignited everything: questions, fears, hope, and the family once again found themselves thrust into the middle of a story they had never asked to be part of. The storm had torn open the landscape, but it had also torn open the case. The lake, long silent, had spoken at last, and what it said was both undeniable and incomplete. It had returned part of him, but not the answer to where he was. And as the family clutched the items that had once been his, one thought lingered in every mind. If the lake could give this back, what else was still waiting beneath its surface? When the battered tackle box was officially logged into evidence, the weight of what it represented pressed down on everyone involved. It wasn't just rusted metal and ruined fishing gear. It was the first tangible proof in nearly a decade that he had truly been swallowed by the lake and not walked away on his own. The box itself looked like it had been torn apart by time. Hinges fused shut, corners bent and jagged, its surface coated in a thick layer of silt and mineral crust. Investigators had to pry it open carefully, unsure of what condition the contents would be in after so long beneath the water. Inside, the devastation of years underwater was obvious. Spools of fishing line were knotted together, their threads brittle and breaking at the touch. Hooks had fused into clumps of corroded metal, their sharpness dulled into harmlessness. Lures that had once been bright with paint and shine were now ghostly, their colors stripped, their shapes half dissolved. But beneath the ruin were objects that still carried unmistakable identity, things no one could deny belonged to him. The pocket knife was the first. Its blade was frozen shut, its surface eaten away by rust, but the handle bore engraved initials, his initials. His sons recognized it instantly, remembering how he carried it everywhere, from camping trips to backyard barbecues. It had been his tool for everything, sharpened so many times the blade had worn down over the years. Even in ruin, it was undeniably his. Then came the lighter. A simple silver case, tarnished and scarred from years submerged, but when investigators rubbed away the grime, letters emerged, his last name etched across its side. The engraving was something his wife remembered clearly. She had given it to him on their 10th anniversary, a small gift that had meant more to him than its simplicity suggested. Seeing it again, even in its ruined state, brought her to tears. And finally, there was the photograph. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a water-stained scrap, the image nearly erased. But under careful light, a faint outline emerged, a younger version of him, standing with his wife, smiling with a fish in hand. Though most of the faces were blurred, the resemblance was clear enough to confirm. It was a snapshot of his life, preserved in the most unlikely of ways, now returned as if to taunt them with memory. For investigators, the box shifted the direction of the case. Until then, all they had was speculation and silence. Now they had artifacts tied directly to him, proof that his belongings had not been stolen, traded, or abandoned. They had been trapped in the lake all along, but questions followed immediately. Why had the box stayed hidden for so long, only to surface now? Had it been lodged in a submerged crevice, pinned under fallen trees, or tangled in debris that the storm had finally dislodged? Or had someone placed it there intentionally, as if to conceal evidence? For the family, the discovery was almost unbearable. His wife held the lighter in her palm, trembling, as if holding onto him again after 10 years of emptiness. His sons pressed their fingers against the knife, remembering countless moments when he had pulled it from his pocket. These objects were not just belongings, they were fragments of him, returned in pieces by the water that had stolen him whole. It reignited their grief in a way that felt as raw as the first days after his disappearance. They were thankful for something, anything, to hold, but the absence of his body made these items feel like cruel substitutes. The community reacted with the same unease that had marked the early days of the case. The tackle box became a kind of relic, proof that the lake truly held things far beneath its calm surface. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, some insisting it was a sign that the rest of him would eventually return, others whispering that the lake had deliberately chosen to reveal only what it wanted. At the diner, theories swirled again. Some claimed foul play, arguing that the items had been weighted and dumped, while others held firm to the idea of an accidental drowning, now partially exposed. Investigators sent the items to the lab, hoping for traces of something more: blood, skin, prints, anything that could point to what had happened. But years underwater had erased nearly everything. No DNA could be recovered, no fingerprints preserved. The box offered identity but not explanation, presence but not cause. It confirmed he had been there, but it gave no answers as to how he had disappeared or why his body had never surfaced. The return of the tackle box didn't close the case, it ripped it open again. His family, once resigned to silence, found themselves pulled back into the storm of uncertainty, forced to re-examine every theory with new eyes. Had he fallen overboard, leaving his belongings to sink? Had someone taken him and tossed the box into the lake to stage an accident? Was the storm's upheaval the only reason they were seeing it now, or was something far stranger at work in those waters? As night fell after the discovery, his wife sat with the lighter in her hand, the engraved letters faint but clear. She whispered that it was like he had reached out from the water to remind them he was still there, still waiting to be found. And though the tackle box answered the question of where some of his belongings had gone, it left the most important question untouched. Where was he? The lake had spoken, but in fragments, in whispers. It had returned objects that carried his name and his memory. And in doing so, it had reminded everyone that it still held the rest of him. The tackle box, knife, and lighter were transferred to the state crime lab under the same protocols as fresh evidence, though everyone involved knew the odds were slim. Nearly 10 years underwater had stripped them of most forensic value. Still, detectives clung to the possibility that some microscopic trace might have survived. The knife, in particular, drew the most attention. If there had been any kind of struggle on the boat, if he had tried to defend himself, if someone had used it against him, there might be traces of blood or tissue locked into the crevices of the handle. Analysts placed it under powerful magnification, swabbed its rusted surfaces, and subjected it to chemical testing. But the results were consistent with time and decay. No readable prints, no biological material intact enough for DNA. The water had scoured it clean. The lighter underwent the same scrutiny. Though it had been engraved and clearly identifiable as his, investigators hoped it might yield partial fingerprints or residue. But the corrosion had eaten through the casing, leaving only faint scratches and mineral buildup. The photograph was too far gone to analyze at all, more artifact than evidence, and was returned to the family as a keepsake rather than an exhibit. The tackle box itself was combed for hairs, fibers, or any sign of tampering, but every surface told the same story. Years of submersion, nothing left behind but rust and decay. Despite the lack of usable forensic evidence, the items carried weight. Their very presence beneath the water suggested he had not left voluntarily. If he had staged a disappearance, why abandon such personal items? Why leave behind the knife he carried daily, the lighter his wife had given him, even a photograph that had clear sentimental value? Investigators reasoned that these objects had gone into the lake with him, whether by accident or by force. The fact that they returned at all meant he likely never left the water alive. This conclusion reignited public speculation. At first, most had accepted the narrative of accident, a stumble, a sudden current, perhaps a medical emergency. But the resurfacing of belongings complicated that view. Theories of foul play grew louder. Some locals began to wonder if another person had been out there with him that morning. The tackle box had been found closed, its contents still inside. Wouldn't a fall into the water scatter items send them drifting? Why did they remain contained, buried, until a storm released them? To some, it hinted at intentional placement, a hand closing the lid before it sank. Detectives, though cautious, did not dismiss these questions. They reviewed interviews from the original investigation, looking again at the people who had last seen him, at anyone with access to the lake that morning. But the years had eroded memories, timelines blurred, recollections contradicted each other. What had once been promising witness statements now felt vague and unreliable. Deputies who had worked the original case admitted that no evidence back then pointed to another person being present. Yet now, with the belongings resurfacing, they could not rule it out either. For the family, the theories cut deep. His wife recoiled at the suggestion of voluntary disappearance, insisting the objects alone disproved it. Her husband had been a man of consistency and devotion, and he would never have abandoned her or their family. His children, however, struggled with the darker possibility that someone else had played a role. They thought of acquaintances, distant relatives, anyone who might have harbored resentment. None of it felt plausible, yet the absence of answers made every theory seem possible. As investigators pressed on, they consulted specialists in underwater recovery. Experts explained that lakes could preserve items in pockets of silt and debris, hiding them intact for years. Entire cars had been pulled from waters after decades, their contents still sealed inside. The storm, they explained, may have loosened the debris field that had trapped his tackle box, setting it adrift until it reached shore. It was a rational explanation, one rooted in physics rather than malice. But not everyone was satisfied. Some continued to insist that the objects felt curated, almost chosen, in the way they reappeared together. Detectives drafted a supplemental report, noting the recovery of the items but marking forensic results as inconclusive. Officially, the case remained undetermined, but behind closed doors, they acknowledged that the discovery changed the tone. What had once been accepted as a likely drowning no longer seemed so straightforward. They could not prove foul play, but they could not dismiss it either. The family, meanwhile, carried the burden of new questions. If he had fallen, Why had no body surfaced in all these years? If someone had harmed him, why had nothing else pointed to a suspect? The tackle box was both a gift and a curse, evidence that confirmed his presence but also deepened the void around his disappearance. At night, his wife kept the lighter on her bedside table. She said it was the first thing she saw in the morning, the last thing at night. It grounded her, a reminder that he had been real, that he had not simply vanished into rumor. But it also haunted her, because every time she looked at it, she thought of the lake, of the storm that had dragged it back to her, and of the possibility that it had been hidden there by more than just water. The forensic tests had given nothing concrete. The lake had taken too much. Yet the weight of what was returned lingered, louder than silence. Theories multiplied, hope and suspicion intertwined, and the truth remained locked somewhere beneath the surface. Weeks after the tackle box surfaced, another storm rolled across the region. It wasn't as violent as the first, but it was strong enough to churn the lake again, pushing water levels higher and stirring the silt at the bottom. Locals were wary now, watching the shoreline closely, half expecting the lake to offer more secrets. And this time, it did. A pair of fishermen working along a newly exposed stretch of marsh noticed something tangled in a mat of reeds. At first they thought it was driftwood caught in discarded netting, but as they pulled closer, they realized the shapes were wrong. What emerged from the mud and cord was not branches or debris. It was bone. Deputies were called immediately, and by nightfall, the area was sealed. Floodlights illuminated the shoreline as crime scene tape went up, the scene echoing the first frantic days of the search years earlier. Only this time, there was no uncertainty about what had been found. Skeletal remains lay half-buried in muck, entwined in fishing netting hardened by time. The sight was grim but unmistakable. After nearly a decade, the grandfather had finally been found. The remains were fragile, brittle from years underwater, yet intact enough to offer confirmation. Investigators carefully recovered each bone, cataloging them piece by piece before sending them to the medical examiner. Within days, dental records provided the answer no one had been able to find for 10 years. It was him. The missing grandfather, the man who had vanished on a quiet morning, was now confirmed. For his family, the news arrived with a strange duality. On one hand, the agony of uncertainty was lifted. The lake had at last returned what it had taken. On the other, the confirmation was brutal, undeniable proof of death that shattered the last thin thread of hope. But the condition of the remains raised new questions. He had been found in a pocket of the lake bed rarely disturbed, wedged in a tangle of netting that had anchored him in place. That explained why his body had never surfaced, why weeks of searching had yielded nothing. The water had claimed him and locked him into a submerged prison, unreachable by divers and unseen by sonar. Yet the positioning of the netting troubled investigators. It was not clear whether he had become entangled after falling or if the net had been part of something larger, discarded gear, or even a deliberate attempt to trap him. The family was told the official cause of death would be listed as drowning, with contributing factors undetermined. But those words did little to settle their doubts. His wife wanted to believe it had been an accident, a tragic misstep that had taken him swiftly. His sons weren't so sure. They pointed out that his boat had been found intact, his belongings contained, no sign of panic or struggle. How did a seasoned fisherman end up entangled so completely in a part of the lake he rarely visited? Why had his body remained hidden for so long in a place search teams had scoured? Rumors in town reignited, this time louder and more confident. Some said the netting was evidence of foul play, that someone had forced him into the water and left him to be claimed by the depths. Others clung to the idea of the lake's curse, insisting it had a way of holding on to what it wanted. For every practical explanation offered by investigators, another story rose to replace it, each one darker than the last. For the family, closure was complicated. They could finally hold a funeral, place a marker, and give him the dignity of rest. But even as they gathered around his grave, the questions remained. The storm had delivered answers, yes, but only partial ones. They knew where he had been. They knew he was gone. But they did not know how he had ended up there, or why his final moments had unfolded the way they did. The lake had given more, but not enough. It had returned his bones, but not the truth. And in that gap, grief and suspicion continued to grow, leaving the family with the unsettling realization that, even with discovery, mystery remained. The medical examiner's report arrived quietly, without the weight one might expect after nearly a decade of waiting. It concluded what officials had hinted from the beginning: accidental drowning. The skeletal remains showed no signs of trauma, no fractures that suggested violence, no evidence of a struggle. The tangled netting was listed as a complicating factor, likely the reason his body had remained hidden all those years. The report noted undetermined circumstances, but the ruling was clear enough for paperwork. He had drowned, lost to the water he had loved. For authorities, the case was finally over. The box could be closed, the file marked complete. But for the family, the words on that report felt like a dismissal, as though a decade of agony could be reduced to a single sentence. His wife held the pages in her lap and wept, not only for what they said, but for what they didn't. There was no explanation of how a man so careful, so experienced, had ended up in that tangle. No acknowledgement of the details that still defied logic. His sons took the report as an insult. They had been there during the first searches, had watched divers sweep the lake again and again, had seen sonar scans that supposedly covered every inch. Yet his body had remained hidden less than half a mile from where his boat was found. How could that have been missed? How could an accident explain a disappearance so complete it had left nothing behind for almost 10 years? To them, the official ruling felt less like truth and more like a way to close the case without further questions. The funeral was small, intimate, and filled with a grief that was both fresh and familiar. His grandchildren, now grown, stood beside their parents, remembering the man only in fragments, stories told, photographs held, rituals at the lake each year. They had been children when he vanished, and his absence had become part of their lives before they fully understood what it meant. Now they faced a final farewell that came with no real answers, only bones pulled from muck and a report that told them less than the silence had. In the weeks after the burial, the lake took on a new kind of weight. For some in town, it was proof that the waters had been cursed all along, capable of swallowing a man whole and keeping him hidden until it chose to release him. For others, it was just another reminder that nature was merciless, that even the most experienced fisherman could be claimed in an instant. But beneath those explanations lingered a quieter, darker suspicion that someone had played a role and that the truth had drowned with him. The family lived with that uncertainty. His wife kept the lighter on her nightstand, lighting it once each evening as a ritual, not because she believed in signs, but because it gave her something of him to hold on to. His sons continued to argue quietly about what had really happened, one insisting it had been nothing more than tragic chance, the other convinced foul play had been involved. The grandchildren, though respectful, had already accepted that they would never know. For them, his disappearance and partial return had become a story that defined their family, one that carried more questions than answers. In the end, the storm had delivered him back, but only in part. It had returned his belongings, then his remains, but not the truth of how he died. That question was left to hang in the silence, unresolved and heavy. And so the case remained what it had always been, a haunting mystery. A man who rose before dawn for a day of fishing, who never returned, and whose final moments were locked forever in the depths of a lake that gave him back only when it chose to.